Okay, so once again, thank you for being here. And let's start. As you will probably know, Agora is an educational foundation. It's a non-profit, it's a charity. It's legally registered in the European Union as a foundation, which, by the way, is the strictest form of non-profit that there is, meaning that unlike associations or other kinds of social companies, so to say, we are under a special kind of supervision and reporting requirements. It was created about three and some years ago, and in 3 years we've expanded to cover more than 70 countries with about already 130 clubs worldwide and over 15,000 members. So what do we do? Agora is basically an educational foundation that trains people in acquiring or improving, if they already have them, their leadership skills. And we see some of the additional skills as supporting, although some people see them as standalone skills like public speaking, critical thinking, and debating. I won't go into details about each of those skills. We see them as accessories to leadership because obviously an efficient leader has to be able to speak in public, has to be able to think critically, has to be able to debate an argument. But we have more extensive general trainings that we schedule regularly and where we talk about those skills. This training is basically a club-oriented training, meaning that we will focus on what you need to start as a club, like immediate tangible needs, more than about theoretical conceptions about what Agora does. I do want to say a couple of things, though, about each of those skills, especially because there are some misconceptions. For public speaking, usually people think that public speaking is a skill that is useful only for, well, for speaking in public in front of an audience. But you will see as you progress through along the educational program that the skills that you acquire in the public speaking training actually make you improve your communication in general, not only in front of an audience, but even in one-to-one interactions, for example, in an interview or with your boss or with a group of friends or even with your partner. Because those skills are generic to communication. Being able, for example, to articulate arguments, being able to have a clear message, being able to transmit, being able to elicit emotions in other people, being able to use a lot of resources for persuading or for explaining, like, I don't know, humor, anecdotes, personal stories. All of that impacts directly in your ability to communicate in general, not only in front of an audience. Now, in critical thinking, we have a program that is designed to give you the tools to know, especially in the modern world where we are basically inundated by all sorts of, I wouldn't even say information, but all sorts of messages, many of them false or manipulated. So in the critical thinking path, we try to give you the tools so that you can discern, you can learn how to check whether something is reliable or not. And we don't only talk about the standard things like logical fallacies or things like that, but how people usually use what are known as psychological biases or cognitive limitations to manipulate other people. And we try to teach you, or to vaccinate if you want, you so that you are aware of those and don't fall into those traps. But we're not going to tell you this source is reliable, this source is not reliable. That's for you to decide. We just give you the tools. And in the debating section, we have a debating system that encourages seeing issues from more than one viewpoint, because most of the modern current debating contests or activities are based around what's traditionally called the British parliamentary debate, in which there is a government and an opposition, and they in alternate turns, and in each turn there is a very strict set of rules about what can be said and what arguments can be introduced. And there are only two teams, and the goal is winning over the opponent. And that's not very realistic, to be honest. not even in parliamentary life anyway anymore. So what we do is have a debate system in which we encourage more than two viewpoints on a single issue, and our rules encourage finding intermediate positions or agreeing on partial issues. Of course, each team, they're not going to give up their core position. They are not going to change their mind on fundamental issues, but we encourage them to seek points of agreement, even if they are partial. And that's a very interesting system, by the way, that is unique in Agora. Now, what is the learning system that we use here in Agora? Well, first of all, I must say, and we have that in the presentation, that Agora clubs are not clubs where someone teaches you anything, or Agora clubs are not clubs where they are not workshops, they are not seminars, they are not lessons, they are not a school class nor anything similar. Agora clubs are basically clubs where you practice. So how do people practice usually? I make this analogy quite frequently. Imagine that you want to learn how to cook. So you have two options. For example, you can go to a cooking class, to a cooking master class. You can pay a lot of money to be trained by a master for a week, maybe. Pick your, I don't know, pick a world famous chef, maybe Gordon Ramsay, maybe Ferran Adrià in Spain. You spend a lot of money to train with him for a week, and then, well, that's it. Hopefully you learn something. That's one approach. And that's one approach that many people take with many things. They do leadership courses or public speaking courses. They go to a seminar. They are immersed for 1 week into something. They pay a lot of money, and that's it. And then there is second approach, which is the approach that we use, and which is the approach that research shows that is much more effective, by the way. And it is, imagine that instead of going to a cooking seminar for 1 week, you join a cooking club. And now in that club, each week you will study how to prepare a particular dish, and then you will cook it for your fellow members. And your members will eat your dish and will give you feedback, their opinion on how well you did or not. And the thing is that you do that week after week after week after week for several months. So, as I said, research shows that people that constantly do things, that constantly put their skills to test or practice things, and they constantly seek to improve based on how well it turned out or based on other people's feedback, they consistently exceed anyone that just goes to a seminar and that's it. And one of the things, by the way, which we do a lot in Agora, it's even in our bylaws, is that we are very science grounded. Everything, all the activities we do, all the techniques that we teach are there in our program because there is research that backs them. And by research, I don't refer to, I don't know, pop science articles or books or anecdotal evidence or, I don't know, IBM did that, therefore it's good, but actual scientific research, the one that is published in peer-reviewed articles. So when I use the term research, I use it in a very formal way. So more specifically, in Agora, the process is that we provide all the educational materials. They are online. They are free for all our members. They are not public domain, but they are free for all our members. And for each of the projects, you will study those educational materials. You will prepare something related to them. The educational program is structured in different projects. So for each of those projects, you will prepare something. That something can be a community project, that something can be an activity within the club, that something can be a speech that you have to present. And then you will practice that in front of the club. You will practice that speech, you will deliver that speech, you will present the results of your project, or you will do an activity in the club. And then all the people will give you their feedback. And with that feedback, you will improve for the next iteration of the cycle. So it's, as you can see, it's uh, for each of those projects, for each of those steps of the educational program, you will have to go through all these phases. Now, there are several core principles that we use in Agora that are fundamental both for the foundation and the clubs, and some of them for the members as well. The first of all is neutrality. Agora is not here to promote any particular viewpoint, neither on religion, nor on social issues, nor on economy, nor on moral, nor on ideology. Agora is strictly neutral, and we expect clubs to be neutral as well, meaning that a club as a whole cannot have an opinion on any particular issue. Members as individuals, of course, they can, and we in fact encourage that. We encourage members to be passionate, to have their opinions, to speak about them, to deliver speeches on them, to be even, let's say, argumentative about them, and to speak without fear of offending anyone. Because for all the things that matter in today's world, you really cannot say anything without risking offending someone. So that shouldn't be stopping you. Now, of course, that freedom also implies that you have to have, and that's the second core principle, tolerance. Tolerance is defined as the capacity to be able to listen to someone, to his presentation or his speech or his project that is deeply disturbing to you, that has a completely different viewpoint with which you completely disagree or deeply disagree, or maybe it even offends you. So, for example, someone can come to a club and deliver a speech saying that the Holocaust doesn't exist, didn't happen. Well, that's a valid subject for a speech. We don't exercise censorship in clubs. People, members especially, need to be able to exercise tolerance. That doesn't mean we don't equate tolerance with respect. I mean, I don't respect many opinions. People that think that the earth is flat, I tolerate that opinion, but I don't respect it as such. Well, the same thing is required from members and from clubs. You need to be able to tolerate other people's viewpoints. You need to be able not to react emotionally to them, not to feel offended by them as much as you can, and definitely not, I don't know, throw a tantrum or stand up and leave or react in a, much less react in a violent way. The proper way to disagree with someone is just to deliver another speech or to have a debate in the club, but never to react in a different way, because that actually gives support to the other person's opinion. All clubs must be non-profit, and our foundation is also non-profit. As you've seen in the presentation, we are for open public clubs, which is one of the types of clubs that we have, and which is the one we are trying to create in Odessa. We are free, meaning that you don't have to pay membership to Agora Speakers International, the foundation, the headquarters. You don't have to pay anything. You don't have to pay membership fees or sign-up fees or access to, or you don't have to buy the educational materials. You don't have to buy anything actually. Well, in fact, you can't. It's not only that you don't have to. You can, because we don't have a shop right now, and probably we're not going to have one for a long time because it's not a priority. But the thing is, clubs can decide. They may decide to charge fees to their members, because clubs have that's going to be your decision when you create the club. That's something in which we don't interfere. If you decide to meet in a place that costs money, then obviously those costs have to be shared by the members. If you have expenses in terms of, I don't know, photocopies or things like that, then yes, probably you will have to distribute that cost among all members. But it's something that it concerns the club exclusively. If you find a free place where to meet, and if you don't have any expenses, then everything can be free to you. That's entirely your decision. Another core principle is equality. You cannot discriminate any members based on any condition. You cannot discriminate on ethnicity. You cannot discriminate on nationality. You cannot discriminate on social origin or social economic status or race or religion or sexual identity or gender identity, whatever. Cannot be any discrimination. There is only one implicit discrimination, sort of, that exists that is acceptable, and that's the language of the club. Clubs can be created in any language. I mean, English is not compulsory. Agora is not about English. It's true that most of the clubs in Agora operate in English, but there are many clubs that don't. Clubs in Portugal, they operate in Portuguese. Clubs in Spain, many of them operate in Spanish. Clubs in Brazil, they operate in Brazilian Portuguese, and so on and so forth. The only limitation is that, well, our educational materials are not yet translated to many languages. For example, we do want to have a translation in Ukrainian, but it's not yet there. But you can create a club that works in English or in Ukrainian or in whatever language. And for people to be able to join that club, obviously they do need to know the language. So that's a sort of a discrimination that is considered valid, but it's like common sense. And the final core principle is what we call intellectual honesty. Intellectual honesty meaning that all members are expected to, that will sound a bit strange, but they are expected to behave a bit like scientists, because in the sense that that's part of our bylaws, in fact, the support of science and the scientific method as a means of discovery, and the promotion of science and technological progress. Meaning that we must keep an open mind towards other people's ideas. We must constantly examine critically both their ideas and our own ideas, which is more difficult because it's very easy to find flaws in other people's arguments, but it's more difficult to examine critically what we ourselves think and believe in. And we must be able to give up those ideas or those beliefs if they are proven wrong, without that meaning anything about us as personalities. So just because, for example, a leader, and that's an absolute critical skill for leaders as well, that is so hard to actually master, so to say. The ability to be able to admit that you were wrong about something and to change course, because if you don't change course, you're going to crash if the reality has proven things to be otherwise. The leaders need to be able to constantly critically examine themselves and see whether their beliefs or their arguments make any sense. So that is what we mean by intellectual honesty. And of course, we expect all Agora members to be intellectually honest in their arguments, meaning that you are not going to manipulate other people, you're not going to present things that you know for a fact that are not true, or things like that. Now, there are all the other, but what we call operational requirements, which are requirements about what the club has to do, what kind of activities, how many activities per year. But for new clubs, this is okay. I mean, you can ignore them up to a point. I just want to draw your attention to the fact that those exist. But for a new club, for the first year at least, while the club is created, you should focus on getting the club stable, getting to know the Agora system, doing the Agora activities, seeing that they are effective, learning, and things like that. Now, what happens in a club? A club is, or better said, club meetings are basically the core of club life. And club meetings happen in a structured way, meaning that you don't just meet and have drinks, or you don't just meet and improvise. Okay, what are we going to do now? No, meetings have a structure, they have an agenda, they are planned, and they're planned in advance, and they are divided into sections. And for each section, there is a person responsible for that section, what we call a role. There is also a meeting leader that is in charge of making sure that the meeting proceeds smoothly, that makes a general introduction, that gives the floor to the different people, etc. Now, the roles of the different sections change every time. So it's not, for example, the same person, the one that is being the meeting leader every single time. In each meeting, roles change. We have some what we call transversal roles that are common to all sections. that are the timer and the grammarian. The timer, for example, is in charge of measuring how much time each section takes, how much time each participant takes, because a meeting cannot be extend to infinity. We have to, at some point, finish. People have their own life as well. But also because in real life, especially if you're a speaker, you do have to develop an inner sense of time as to how much time you have to transmit your message. If you're at a conference, or if you're giving a speech, or if you're being interviewed, you have a very limited time in which you can transmit your message. If you exceed that time, bad things happen. If you're at a conference, then the next speaker and the organizers will look not very happy if you exceed your time. They probably won't invite you anymore. And if you are being interviewed by the media, then they will simply finish, or they will turn off your mic, and that's it. If you manage to transmit your message, fine. If not, so sorry. So all speakers need to be aware of what their time is and be able to transmit their message within that time. So that's the role of the timer. And the grammarian, what he does is monitor the use of the language. He monitors the use of the language, not only indicating things that were not incorrectly used, but things that were particularly appropriate. Like, for example, a very appropriately used word, or a very interesting idiom or phrase, or whatever. And one of the things that the grammarian does also is present the word of the day. The word of the day is something that is not known until the time of the meeting. We call it word of the day, although it can be the idiom of the day, or the phrase of the day, or the quote of the day. And speakers, anyone that is intervening in that meeting, they should try to to add that word into their speech. Why do we do that? Because we try to make sure that people don't memorize their speeches. There's nothing worse in a speaker than a memorized speech. Memorized speeches, unless you are absolutely brilliant and rehearse an enormous amount of time, you will not be able to pull out of a naturally sounding memorized speech. And one of the fundamental characteristics of any speaker is being able to be natural. If you're natural, you will have authority, and people will believe you and will follow you. If, on the other hand, you sound memorized, fake, phony, robotic, you just dump, or you, as some people say, you vomit your memorized speech onto them like a robot, that is a disaster for your authority and credibility. So having a word of the day that you don't know what's going to be, and encouraging people to introduce it in their speeches makes sure that you don't memorize it, because you have to be able to improvise. Now, one of the critical roles of the meeting are what we call the evaluators. Each section has a different, well, hopefully different. If the club is very small, then it's quite possible that a single person may have more than one role. But ideally, each section has their own different evaluator. And the role of the evaluator is giving his opinion on how the section went, what was good, what was bad, what can be, and for those things that were not so good or that were bad, what can be done for them to be improved. Now, as I mentioned before, meetings are timed. Each section is timed, and meetings have an agenda which is a description of what will happen in the meeting, what sections are there going to be, how long each section is going to be, who is in charge of that particular section, and what are the minimum and maximum allotted times. For example, here you see the beginning of, well, a very old, one of the first meetings that we had in Madrid 3 years ago, and a sample agenda of, as you can see, role, who is doing that role, general description, and we have these green, yellow, and red boxes because that's what the timer uses to signal the time. Usually a meeting will run between 1 and 2 hours. That's more than enough. If you do longer meetings, then people will become tired, because after all, it's an intellectual activity and people have to be focused and listening. Now, here are some of the sections that you can do in a meeting. As you can see, depending on the colors, some of the sections are intended to train public speaking skills. Some of those sections are intended to train leadership skills. Some of them are intended to teach critical thinking or debating on and argumentation. Now, of course, you will not be able to have all the sections in all the meetings. For each meeting, you'll decide, that's up to you. Each club decides how to structure their agendas. For each section, you will decide, sorry, for each meeting, you will decide which sections you want to have. And this is where I'm tie those operational requirements that I mentioned before tie in, because, for example, you have the debate section, but debates are usually quite long. A debate can be 1 hour perfectly. So you cannot have like a debate and 5 other sections in a meeting. Usually, if you have a debate, that's about the whole meeting plus a couple of other sections. But you still have to have at least 4 debates a year. Otherwise, this part of the training is very lacking, and it will be a great loss if you don't have them. But for the beginning, the beginning of the life cycle of a club, when you're just starting, don't bother on having all the on trying to do all the sections or learning about them. Start small, and grow from there. Don't try to do everything. In fact, one of the interesting things about starting a club is precisely exploring all what Agora has to offer, all the ecosystem of activities. So here is usually how a meeting proceeds. Usually the meeting leader, again, remember that all the roles that I mentioned here change from meeting to meeting. Meeting leader is not like the president of the club, always the same. No, the meeting leader for each meeting will be different. How you decide who is going to be the meeting leader for, or who is going to be in charge of this or that section for every meeting, that's a bit up to you. That's however way you want to organize it. So usually the meeting leader will start with by introducing the meeting. He will start usually with a small introduction about the purposes of the club, about how it belongs to Agora Speakers International, about the goals of the foundation, and he will also ask some normal things, like, for example, people to turn off their mobile phones or not to walk or make noises while someone is speaking, not to enter and leave the room while someone is speaking, out of respect. And obviously, the introduction will vary depending on who is attending the meeting. So, for example, if in a meeting you don't have any guests and you don't have any new members, then it's pointless to be explaining over and over again what Agora is about, because all the people attending are already veteran members, so they already know it. There's no point in repeating it. Just maybe reminding them to turn off their mobile phones. So the meeting leader has to be able to improvise depending on the circumstances, on the attendance, and guests can show at any time. Then the meeting leader will introduce usually the timer. This is a recommended structure, okay? Once you have the club up and running, and once you more or less know how things work, you're free to alter things in the way that best works for you. But we recommend that you start with the standard way, and then you can experiment. So after that, the meeting leader will introduce the timer. The timer will come in front of the people. And that's important. No one speaks from their seat. This is about public speaking. It's not about giving a toast on a table, at the table. So people have to actually walk in front of the rest, in front of the club, and speak from, maybe it's not a stage as such, but at least it's a separate area that belongs to the speaker. And then they go back to their places. So the timer will introduce his role. We will explain what he will be doing, how, why is it important. Then the meeting leader will introduce the grammarian. The grammarian will talk about a bit about his role. We'll present the word of the day. And then that is the introduction part of the meeting. And then for each section of the meeting, you will have the same routine over and over again. First, the meeting leader will introduce the section evaluator. The section evaluator will come in front and will explain to the rest of the members what is the goal of the section and how the section is going to be evaluated. So, for example, if the section is about a prepared speech by someone, and that prepared speech is about learning how to properly use, for example, body language, then the section evaluator will say something like, okay, so John is going to give a presentation or is going to give a speech that has the goal of body language. So we have to be especially vigilant on how he uses body language, how he moves across the stage, how he uses his hands, how he uses his body to transmit what he's speaking, whether his gestures are convincing enough, whether his gestures are natural, whether his gestures are synchronized with what he's talking about, whether they transmit the same message or transmit something completely different. So after the evaluator explains what the project is going to be about, then the stage belongs to the person that is in charge of that stage, the speaker, the project leader, whatever. And then usually there will be a small pause, 1 to 2 minutes, for everyone to think about their evaluation. And then the section evaluator will provide her evaluation. Again, she will come in front because the evaluator always evaluates in public in front of everyone, so that not only the person that is being evaluated can learn, but also the rest of the members of the club. And she will say, okay, John, so you did this. This was particularly good. This was so-so. I believe you could improve on that. We'll have a special talk on evaluations because that's an absolutely critical thing, a thing in Agora, knowing how to do them properly. Because actually an evaluator has several roles or has several tasks. One of them is being able to motivate the person that she's evaluating, in the sense that you cannot, if you're an evaluator, you cannot go and say, wow, everything was terrible. I didn't like your speech at all, or I didn't like your project at all, because that person is, first of all, is going to be depressed, probably, and second, he'll never return to the club. But the other extreme is also very bad. If the evaluator says, for example, wow, I think you did a great job. Everything was fantastic. I don't really have anything to tell you where you can improve. That's also a disaster because the person being evaluated didn't learn anything. If there's nothing that he or she can do to improve, then again, what's the point of coming to a club? Remember always that clubs are educational in nature. What's happening in a club is not social life, is not socialization. That's fine. After the meeting, you can have drinks or dinner or whatever. But during the meeting, the goal is educational. So people have to be able to learn something from their presence there. It's not about just meeting people. In fact, one of the things that evaluators have to do is also be specific always. So for example, if an evaluator says, I liked your speech, that's not very useful because she isn't saying what exactly she liked in the speech. She isn't saying anything specific. It's just a diffuse praise. And in the opposite, it can be the same. I didn't like your speech. What exactly you didn't like? How can I improve that? So evaluators have to be always specific. So for example, I love the way you move through the stage. I love the way you use your voice to impersonate the different protagonists of your story. I love the rhetorical devices that you used. I particularly love that metaphor that you used, or whatever. And when the evaluator is saying something that she didn't like, she also has to provide suggestions on how the speaker can improve. So for example, I think that you were too static. You were standing all the time in the same place. And I believe, and that's the suggestion, that if you could move towards the audience, for example, when you're addressing someone in particular, when you're asking him a question, that would have been much better. As you can see, it's an opinion plus a suggestion. Anyway, there will be a special recorded session on evaluations because it's very important that you are able to do that. Now this repeats for each section, and after that is concluded, after all the sections are done, comes the conclusion of the meeting, where the meeting leader will call the grammarian. The grammarian will provide a report on how people did, how many used the word of the day, whether they were having any clutch words or parasite words. Then the timer will provide his report, how people did on time, who was over time, who was under the minimum time. And then we'll have what's called a meeting evaluator that evaluates the whole of the meeting. whether it started on time, whether the venue was okay, whether there was too much noise. He also evaluates the evaluators, whether they provided a proper evaluation, a useful evaluation, an actionable evaluation, and in general suggestions for improving the club life. Now, most of the activities that we saw before, they can be repeated indefinitely. For example, things like debates, the thought of the day, or media analysis, or language games, you can do, the same person can do them over and over again. And that's practice, and that's useful. And that's it. And they are self-contained activities. There is nothing more to them. You do a debate, that's it. Next time you do a debate, it's going to be the same structure, the same things, the same goals. The same with thought of the day, improvised speeches, etc. But for prepared speeches, things are different because prepared speeches are part of a program. We have first what we call the basic educational path, which is a set of 16 projects designed to teach you public speaking from the very basic things, like, for example, having a structure in your speech, being able to transmit a single message and not being all over the place in what you intend to say, being crystal clear, to more advanced things like using humor, using anecdotes, using emotion, and having a strong charisma on stage. Each of these projects has different objectives and different goals and different techniques that you need to learn. So unlike, for example, debates or any other activity, if you do a prepared speech once, it will have a set of goals. Next time, you will advance on along the educational program, and for a prepared speech, you'll have different goals, and so on until you complete the 16 projects. Of course, you can repeat the same project over and over again if you're not sure about how well you did, but ideally, you should be able to progress. Now, many of those projects are divided into two parts. One part is what we call speech analysis, in which you have to find a speech that you like from someone else. That can be a YouTube speech, it can be from a politician, from an actor, from a TEDx event, from a conference, from, I don't know, a commencing ceremony at a university, anything. It doesn't need to be from someone famous, it just needs to be a speech that you like. And you have to analyze that speech and present your analysis to the club from the viewpoint of the project. So, for example, if the project is about body language, then you analyze the body language of the speaker and you present a report in front of the club so that the club sees or hears the speech and then can learn from what you discovered. And then after you have done the speech analysis part, in a different meeting, you do the speech practice, which is you delivering a speech that has body language, the goal, for example. Now, after you have finished the basic educational path, you can continue with some of the advanced paths that we have that are designed for speaking in particular contexts that are much more advanced. The basic educational path is like more generalistic. The advanced ones are for particular careers or for particular professional occupations. So, for example, you have storytelling, you have speaking for entrepreneurs, you have speaking in business context, depending on what is your professional or, I don't know, your passion or your inclination. Each of those paths in turn has between 7 and 12 projects that have to be done. Now, a very important part of the meetings are the evaluations, as I mentioned. In fact, it's absolutely critical. Usually, you will have a personal evaluator that will evaluate your performance at the meeting. The evaluator is also going to be different from meeting to meeting. It's not going to be always the same person. And in that, the evaluations that he does will be using a particular card, a particular evaluation sheet that will direct him as to what he has to look into in your project. But then, and he will deliver that evaluation in front of the meeting for everyone so that everyone can learn. And that evaluation card, he will give it to you in writing form. And now the rest of the members and the guests, if they want to participate, they will use a generic evaluation form that is has some general criteria. You can find those on the website. Actually, now that we are here, I would like to make a pause in order to point to you where exactly those things are on the website, because many times people apparently are not able to find them. So for example, let me share a different screen. Okay, I think it's this one. So this is our wiki. This is where all our documentation is. Right now, you don't need any login or any registration to access it. In the future, you will. As I mentioned, the educational materials are free, but they are free for members. They are not accessible. They shouldn't be accessible for anyone else. So for example, here in meeting roles, you have this every single role that I mentioned before described. So for example, if you're the timer of a meeting, then you go here and you read what the timer does, and you have a lot of hints and tips and how to signal time, how to measure time, how to indicate that something is happening. So it should be part of your basic preparation to read about your role that you're going to perform at the meeting. And all the roles, as I mentioned, are explained in this section. And now, regarding the educational program, the basic educational path is located here. By the way, right above it, you have an explanation on how exactly to do the speech analysis project, and that's important. Now, the basic educational path, as I mentioned, is divided into 16 projects. And for each of those projects, well, depending on which one, you have to do them in order. You start by the first one and then progress downwards. And when you have to do, I don't know, the second project, for example, speaking about the things you like, you come here, you click, and you see exactly what needs to happen. What are your learning objectives? What are your prerequisites? How much time you have for that project? In this particular case, between 2 and 4 minutes. What you need to do in that project. And at the bottom, there are notes for the evaluator, the indications about what the evaluator has to do, and the evaluation card itself. The design is going to change, but the questions are going to remain the same. So don't be surprised if you see something else. And each project is different. So for example, if you go to the vocal variety projects, well, the learning objectives are different. As you can see, things become more difficult because, for example, here it tells you that you cannot use notes. You cannot, you may not be hiding behind a podium or a lectern. And you have a lot more time to speak, between 5 and 7 minutes. And the more time you have, the more difficult it usually is. And there are then 2 evaluation cards because this project has 2 parts, one speech analysis and one speech delivery. And again, the evaluator will have his evaluation card to evaluate you. Now, to continue, yes, at the end of that's a question that usually shows up. At the end of the educational paths, we do provide a digital certificate and a digital badge. But you should be focused on actually the skills that you learn more than on getting the certificate. And outside of the individual clubs, we do a lot of joint events. We do regional conventions in which several clubs can participate, and they do have like workshops and training seminars. And once a year, we do have an international convention. Last one was in Portugal, in Lisbon, in September. Next one is going to be in Kathmandu, in Nepal, next September 2020. And each year it is in a different country and in a different continent, a bit like the Olympic model. As part of our international conventions, we're starting next year an international contest for, as you can see, the speeches are very goal oriented, for the best educational speech, for the best storytelling, best social awareness. And in general, we do hope that Ukraine sends a nice contestant delegation. Now, where to find things? This is important, although the main tool that you should be using is the wiki, where all our documentation is. We have a chat platform that is unrelated to Facebook that we are going to be using more and more and encouraging people to use more and more, because although we have a strong presence in Facebook, both we have the international group and then one per country, one group per country, and then we have pages and then we have chat channels. But we want to get away from Facebook, to be moving slowly away from them, both for privacy reasons and because we don't have to have so much dependency on them. So the chat platform is something that you can use with almost no registration, and we encourage you to use it. Now, you have decided to start your club. Okay, so what do you do on the first meeting? You just meet, and now what happens? Now, what we recommend is that you forget about the rest of the sections and just focus on these that are in green here. And as you have meetings for this club, and as you progress and as you train and continue having meetings, you can begin to incorporate other sections when you feel comfortable that you have mastered the existing ones, the basic ones. So the absolute minimum that you should have in a meeting is at least a prepared speech from the educational program. Anyone can do that. A speech evaluator, because everything needs to be evaluated. Then you need to have at least a team of two for the analytical reports. That would be the timer and the grammarian. There are other things that can be analyzed. We do have like a listening evaluator. We do have a body language evaluator, but these are a bit more advanced roles, also analytical. You don't need them for the first meetings. Then we recommend that you have a section on improvised speeches. Improvised speeches, or hot questions as we call them, are questions, realistic questions that are prepared to train you to be able to respond quickly, think on your feet, and provide a coherent response to someone that is asking you an unexpected question. It can be an interview, it can be in an elevator, it can be in a social context. You need to be prepared for those. So, for example, the person in charge of the hot questions sections or the improvised speeches section can ask you, okay, imagine that you're at a job interview and the interviewer asks you, what is your worst trait or what is your worst attribute? How will you answer? And then you have to improvise. The victim picked by him for this particular question has to improvise an answer within a certain amount of time. And that trains you for those situations. And then you can have the thought of the day or the idea of the day or the movie of the day. It's whatever you liked of the day. That is a very short speech between 2 and 4 minutes usually. Now, if you can see, if you get those sections at the end, you end up with a meeting that is about 1 hour. If you add all the rows of this suggested agenda, you have a meeting that is between 1 hour and 1:30. 1:30 because with all the applauses and with all the going to the stage and returning to someone's seat, in the end, time adds up, apart from all the interruptions. And to have this kind of meeting, you only need actually 8 people, and that's the origin of our requirement for having at least 8 members for starting a club. You will need a meeting leader, you will need an evaluator, you will need a timer and a grammarian, a speaker, obviously, someone has to deliver the prepared speech, a leader of the hot questions section. Of course, if you only have 8 attendees, then the leader of the hot questions section will be using the other people as victims and asking them questions, but that's fine. The important thing, I always say that, the important thing about the club is actually starting. That's the more difficult part. Once you start, you will grow, and you will grow quickly because the kinds of things that we train, the kinds of things that we prepare you for, the kinds of activities that we do, there is a huge amount of demand for them. And people that do these things professionally, they charge a huge amount of money for those. I mean, a professional public speaking seminar can be well over $1,000 for a week, and you're getting all this practice for free, totally. So the most important thing is actually starting, and it's also the most difficult. Now, just a short comment on the kinds of clubs that we have. All that, everything that I've been talking about here is about what we call open public clubs. Open public clubs are clubs that are open to everyone. They don't have any restrictions apart from, well, availability of space where they meet, but there are no other conditions. And, well, and no in the language of the club. And those clubs are free. There are other kinds of clubs that you can read in the documentation: public interest clubs, restricted clubs, corporate clubs that may restrict membership. For example, corporate clubs are usually only for employees of a company. And not every type of club is free. We do have fees for some of those clubs. In fact, that's part of our economic model. In corporate and restricted clubs, they support the rest of the foundation, apart from grants and things like that, donations. We also have a youth program that is being developed. It's being led by Fred from Canada, and it started as an initiative in Portugal. We call it a youth program. It's targeted. It targets people below 14, I would say, in school, early school and preschool ages, and it's like a simplified version of our educational program. You can see some images here of recent events from Portugal. But for anyone above 14, 15 especially, we think that they can perfectly well follow the adult program without any problems. Now, how to start? As I mentioned before, the recipe for success is starting at some point. The sooner the better. It doesn't need to be the perfect moment, because actually that moment will never come. If you're waiting for the perfect moment to come to start a club, that will never come. You don't need to have the perfect knowledge of Agora and the activities. You don't need to have the perfect number of members. You don't need to have the perfect venue, because people that delay starting, trying to find perfection, they actually never start. And we have some experience by now about which clubs are successful and which are not. And the unsuccessful clubs, or well, the let's say that the epitome of being unsuccessful is not being able to start at all. And people that didn't start at all are usually people that delayed too much, or that just tried to find something exceptionally good to start. Just start. Doesn't need to be perfect. Make mistakes, because you will make them, and that's the whole part of the learning process. To make mistakes, to face the real problems of the club, and then of course to learn from them and to fix them. Because many times what people do is they don't start, and they spend a lot of time thinking about hypothetical problems, or problems that might happen, or issues that might arise, and then they spend huge amounts of time trying to solve those when they in reality haven't even happened yet, or probably they won't happen ever. And while you waste time thinking about solving imaginary problems, you're not using time for solving the actual problems that you will face, that usually are very different from the ones you imagine. And unfortunately you cannot predict them. The only way to solve those problems is to actually experience them or face them. Of course, you can plan for some of them. You can try to uh, think about what can happen, but reality usually will correct you immediately. So start as soon as you can. Don't delay it. Try to have club meetings. Make the mistakes. See what problems exist and address those problems, because those are the real problems, not others imagined. And then, of course, you can ask for feedback, both from the members and from the worldwide community. After all, at 130 clubs already, there are a lot of people with experience there already. Some of the clubs have existed for over 3 years, since from the very starting days of Agora, three years ago. So there's a lot of accumulated experience. By all means, feel free to ask anyone. Now, some additional steps that I would recommend you is to read the documentation. Again, Agora is huge and we are adding constantly more and more documentation. I wouldn't recommend that you try to learn everything before starting. Just learn the basic rows and then start with that. And you expand your knowledge as you proceed. It's just like, I don't know, if you want to become a pilot, you don't spend 4 years studying how an Airbus works and learning to fly an Airbus. No, you start with smaller one engine airplanes flying only in visual, what is called visual flight rules, only during the day when there are no clouds. And then you, from there, once you've mastered the basics, you proceed. You go to multiple engines, you go to instrumental flights, you go to best commercial flights, and that's it. It's a progression. Here it's the same. Don't try to learn everything at once. We have what we call the Agora Guide, which is a good read as well. Right now it's a bit obsolete. We will have the second edition quite soon. So for now, I would say use the wiki above all. And it's always a good thing to watch. There are videos being posted constantly on the Agora, in the Agora groups, to watch examples of meetings and how things work. And then you have to decide on several parameters of the club, like the club name. Usually people go for the first club in the city, they go for the city name. That's why the chat group is called Agora Speakers Odessa, but you can change it afterwards if you don't like it. The name Agora doesn't need to be in the club name. That's a bit up to you. You could be called, I don't know, Advanced Speakers of Odessa or Fabulous Speakers of Odessa or just Fabulous Speakers. No need to include the city name. What you can't do is use international or the country name in the club, because then it confuses people as to whether that club somehow represents the whole country, or maybe even it's official. So it cannot be Agora International Speakers of Odessa. That would be sound very weird. We always encourage clubs to have a logo. By default, we'll create you one logo, which we call the standard logo, which is the Agora logo plus your club name. But from there, you can, once you have enough membership and once you have enough, like, once you have created an identity, that takes a bit of time to evolve. And once the club has a special atmosphere, you can create your own logo. And by all means, we encourage you to do that. And now, one very important part that you need to decide, actually very early in the beginning, is whether the club will have any fees or not. As I mentioned, that's up to you. As far as we are concerned, Agora Speakers International, you don't have to pay us anything. But if you need to share some costs, then probably the club will have some fees. And in fact, we do recommend that clubs have fees, small, affordable, so that people have some sort of commitment to actually attending the sessions of the club, and also so that the club can sustain itself to pay for printing or so for photocopies or for microphones or whatever. Now, if the club charges fees, there are several rules. There are a lot of rules that must be obeyed, but they all revolve around the fact that finances must be transparent, accounting must be published so that everyone knows where the money is going. And by everyone, I not only mean the members of the club, but everyone in Agora Speakers International, all members of the Agora worldwide community. So it's a bit like a cross audit thing. Everyone audit everyone else. Clubs can be used only for club operation. You cannot, I don't know, finance your private trip or to some other place. And if the president wants to spend a significant amount of the club funds, then he must get membership approval. And that membership approval is not perpetual. It lasts for 1 year. So if a club president wants to buy a subscription to some service that is very expensive, then that approval needs to be renewed every year. You also have to decide how often you're going to meet. Usually clubs meet between once a week or once a month, which is the minimum. Less than once a month, that is no longer a club. The whole point of a club is having a place where you can periodically practice. If the club doesn't meet, then the whole purpose of the whole thing is lost. Although, by the way, there are clubs that meet even in Madeira in Portugal. The Funchal Club meets twice a week. That is quite a thing. Our recommendation is that you meet at least once a week or once a week. This will make the club harder to start because it's difficult that everyone can attend the meetings every week. People will be missing. During the first meetings, you will lack enough people. Some sessions you will find people, I don't know, 4 or 5 people showing up. It will be harder than deciding to meet, for example, every first and third Tuesday. But in the long term, it will be much easier for everyone and it will grow much faster because the problem with first and third Tuesday is that people always have to be thinking, okay, today's Tuesday. Is it the first? Is it the third? I have to look it up on the calendar. I have to decide whether and what happened if the first is was a holiday. So now we have like 3 weeks without a meeting, or was it because it was a holiday? Now we have a meeting on the second Tuesday. It's a mess. If you decide to meet weekly, it's much easier. If you decide we have a meeting every Tuesday, okay, so people know it's Tuesday. There's a meeting. Period. Nothing to fret about, or nothing to think about. And again, the recipe for success is persevering. I always use the example of Emmanuel Antwi from Ghana. Don't be discouraged. At his first meeting, only 5 people showed up because there was a huge rain in Accra, in Ghana, despite, I don't know, 10 or 12 or 12 confirming. But he persevered. He was consistent. He had a meeting every week. And now, not only his club is healthy, but there are 8 clubs in Ghana, 7 more that all spawned from that initial club. So the secret for every success is perseverance and being constant. If you give up just because, I don't know, some meeting only 4 people turned out, then you'll never pull it off. But not only the club, in general, these kinds of disappointments will happen. Of course, that doesn't mean that you don't do anything for next time. Maybe you should try to examine what happened and learn from that. Maybe the location wasn't properly announced. Maybe I need to provide a picture of the venue so that can people find it. Maybe the time wasn't convenient. Maybe something else. Whatever. Try to adapt. And now you have to have a minimum of members. As I mentioned, the minimum is absolute 8. We don't recommend 10 to 12 though. And you will need to have an initial set of officers. You can read about what each officer does in the documentation. But that's the idea is that it club activities they do require time to organize. They do require time to schedule. As you have seen probably in the chat group, it does take time to be reminding members all the time. Please vote. Please select the time when we're starting now, etc., etc. And even with that, it not always works as expected. But still, that takes time. So it's the set of officers in a club has the role of spreading or sharing the effort that it takes to run a club. And then the final thing that you need to find is a venue where to meet. Usually, you can ask for help for other members. Many times other members have suggestions. Many times they do have a place already. They do know someone, or they do not do. They own a company and they can offer a room on their premises to have the meetings. Many times, you can also ask for help from schools, universities, and libraries. That usually works because it's a win-win agreement for everyone. You get a room for free, and the school or university or library or co-working space, they get an activity that they can offer to their visitors that doesn't cost them anything. They don't, not only in terms of money, but it doesn't cost them anything to organize because you're doing all the organizational work and you're doing all the training work, so to say. So it's for them it's usually perfect. If you go to the dean or even to a teacher and tell him, listen, we are a non-profit. We do public speaking training and we do leadership training and critical thinking and debating, and we are looking for a venue. In exchange, any of your students or any of your class or any of your university can join, and it's completely free. You don't have to do anything. Most of the time, it works. If that doesn't work, then you have pubs, cafes, restaurants where owners are usually happy to give you a room in exchange for people ordering something. a drink or two, or maybe having dinner after that at the place. And if that doesn't work and the weather is appropriate, you can have the meeting in an open space. Not ideal, but sometimes that works quite well, actually. In Spain, there are several clubs that, despite the fact that they have a venue, they do open air meetings in parks, and that's quite interesting because first it pushes members outside of their comfort zone, and second, uh, it also serves as some sort of recruiting campaign, meaning that people that walk by, they are curious, they stop, they start to listen what's happening there, what kind of activity it is. I see some weirdo giving a speech there, and they are usually start asking questions, and many of them actually end up joining the club. So after all of this is done, the only thing that remains is actually registering the club, registering it officially so that it's recognized and announced. We need to know when is your next scheduled meeting. That should be at least a week in advance so that we have time to prepare everything. You need to submit a registration form that basically contains, well, the basics of the club information, when is your next meeting, at least 8 members, and the meeting agenda, just to make sure that we ask for the meeting agenda for the first meeting in order to make sure that everyone understands what Agora is about. Because we have had many cases in the past in which people just submit a registration and they start meeting and they don't have any idea what to do during the meetings. So now we expect people to know in advance before registering. After that, we create one of these cute announcements that we share in the international groups, one for each club, and we promote it so that hopefully you can get more attendance at your first meeting. And well, that's it. We hope that after the meeting you have a great turnout and you share the pictures of your success. And success is initially just even having a meeting. Don't be shy to share that, even if only 4 or 5 people, as I mentioned, show up, because that's the first step. You've done 60%, 50 to 60% of the whole thing. After that, after you've met once and you've decided to continue meeting, it's super easy to continue, actually, and you will grow 100% guaranteed, as long as you don't stop or you don't become disappointed. In that case, well, it's a failure. So that's everything I had to share with you today. If you have any questions, feel free to ask them. You can either unmute yourself or you can type them in the chat. And if there are no questions, we'll finish them. Any questions?
Thank you so much for the presentation. I just wanted to ask a very quick question.
Yeah.
And my question is, for example, what are the areas of discussion? Like, if a meeting is to be scheduled, um, what's the criteria of selecting what is going to be discussed, or what kind of speech, or I mean,
Yeah,
of the agenda?
everyone decides their own subject. There are no restrictions. There's only one restriction, sorry, and that is hate speech. We don't allow hate speech in clubs, meaning people that come out. That has never happened, by the way, but just in case, people coming out and saying we should kill everyone, we should kill all black people, we should kill all immigrants, or we should, I don't know, whatever. Anything that encourages violence or hatred is not allowed. Apart from that, the subject is up to you. You can talk about anything you like, even if it's deeply controversial, that's up to you. Even if it's strongly political, strongly religious, that's up to you. Others should be able to tolerate that. That's the whole point. And one thing that is important is that evaluators do not evaluate content. The evaluators, especially the speech evaluators, they only evaluate delivery. So an evaluator should never get into arguments regarding the content, like saying, I don't agree with what you said, or what you said is wrong, or you lie, well, things like that. It's not a debate. The evaluator focuses on delivering only.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Any more questions? Feel free.
Um, can meetings be held here in Odessa?
Sorry, say again.
Can meetings be held like maybe we'll find a location to meet over here in Odessa?
I'm not sure I understand you. Well, half of it I can't hear you. I, you're talking about meetings in Odessa, but what exactly?
Like to meet, like the persons in the group, like to meet over here in Odessa, like for
Yes.
a meeting or something. Is it done?
No, actually, usually the process we follow when helping people to start a club is we first put people in contact with each other. That's the role of this common chat group, so that you know who is interested. We do one of these trainings. That's an exceptional thing. We usually, I mean, 100 and probably 20 clubs before you weren't that lucky. They didn't have any training like this. They didn't have any explanations. They only had the documentation to read and recordings of previous meetings. And after that, it's really up to you. I mean, we can only help so much. We can't find you a venue, and we can't be constantly pushing you to have a club because at the end of the day, as I usually mention, that we are all volunteers in Agora. No one is here to make any money, and we're not charging anything. So we don't gain anything from anyone in particular joining or not joining Agora. We can't really force you to learn or to have meetings or whatever. If you want, fine. If you don't want, fine as well. But one thing you shouldn't be expecting from this point on is for me to be pushing constantly to have a club, because you also have to have a desire. And I'm talking because there are like 18 people in the Odessa group, but only six chose to show up today. So the rest of the effort, I mean, we'll be, if we see that you're very interested and motivated to start a club, we will support you, of course. We will be there for answering questions, or for if you need an official letter from us addressed to a university or a school, we can provide that, like saying, listen, we are Agua Speakers International. It's not just a club in Odessa. We are worldwide. We are legally registered. We're a charity. We endorse this club, so please help them find the venue, or please offer them a meeting room. We can do all that, but 60% of what's remaining, 70% of what's remaining is already your task, actually. And I would say the first thing you need to do is find the venue, and the second thing, agree on a date and time and have the first meeting. Don't delay too much. If you spend like 1 month trying to do those two things, the interest of all the people that are in the group will evaporate, and it will disappear. So that's already your job. We're not physically in Odessa, so we cannot help more. More questions? That, in fact, is part of, let's say, part of the leadership training. You do have to have the drive to not only the, how to say it, not only the desire for things to happen, you have to be willing to act on those desires. Because if you only have dreams, well, fine, everyone has dreams. But if you are willing to, if you really want them to turn into something real, you actually have to have a plan and execute it. Not just, okay, I have a dream, but that's it. Or I want to achieve this, but I'm not willing to do anything. There are no shortcuts in life.
Excuse me, please. How
Yeah.
soon can we get the letter? Like right now, I think I have an idea of institutions around where I can deposit the letter and ask for permission, maybe to use the premises for
Yeah,
the
you
meeting.
can get it in a day, as long as you give us the name of the person and the institution that we need to address it to, because we don't write generic letters. I mean, it has to be, and generic letters don't usually work. It needs to have the dean of the university or the owner of the place, and then we will address the owner explicitly.
Okay, Thank you.
But you can send us an email or in the chat group. You can post a message like this is the data, and you have the letter in 1 day maximum.
Okay, that's right. Nice.
Mhm. Okay. Any more questions? Okay. Then thank you everyone, and well, I hope we do have a club in Odessa soon. Thank you.
Thank you too for your patience and thank you for the explicit explanation. We really hope that this it's worth it.
It is. It is. Actually, one of the things that people are surprised is that the system works so well. It doesn't take like I don't know years of practice. Usually, if you do get the club started and if you attend regularly, you will see in public speaking at least. Leadership takes a bit more, but in public speaking, you will see a huge improvement in 2 or 3 months maximum if you like really attend the meetings and speak. Okay, thank you everyone, and have a nice evening.
Thank you too.